Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here. Cosmic Summit, I've had a wonderful time. Katie and I are having a wonderful time. I want to thank George Howard for putting it all together. Where is George? He must be here somewhere. There he is. Good. How about a round of applause for George? But let me dive right into it. I believe you're looking at my title, because I can't actually see them here, my title slide. And what I'd like to do is talk about the evidence of true civilization at the end of the last ice age, and then the solar outburst that destroyed it. So this is really, in many ways, a summary of over 3 decades of work on my part. So I actually got involved in working on ancient civilizations in a professional sense. In the late 1980s, I met John Anthony West. Some of you have heard of him. And I was at Boston University as a faculty member at Boston University. I joined Boston University in 1984 after getting my PhD in geology and geophysics in 1983 at Yale University. And John Anthony West invited me to Egypt because he had heard that I'm a geologist. He had actually spoken to a fellow faculty member of mine who happened to get a job at Boston University. He was actually an English professor, the other faculty member, and he recommended me as someone who could go and look at the Sphinx objectively from a geological point of view, because there was this question as to what is the origins of the Sphinx, how far back do the origins of the Sphinx go? And this is really what got me started thinking about ancient civilization and how far back ancient civilization could go. And I want to give you the background information right now. The standard paradigm of the origins of civilization was put together by a number of different researchers in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, and really sort of espoused, should we say, in a popular way, both among the academics and the general public, by a man named V. Gordon Childe. And this is the standard story that in many ways is still taught in our universities around the world, that humans started out as savages, as hunters, gatherers, foragers, then sort of graduated to barbarism in a technical sense with early cultivation, with agriculture, having small villages. Then the whole concept was that these villages would build up. The villages, agriculture, cultivation, V. Gordon Childe called the Neolithic Revolution, or the agricultural revolution, and that was seen as a necessity to then graduate, if you would, to civilization, true civilization, which included high culture, monumental architecture, sophisticated technology, literacy, more or less writing and recording, and that this last stage was reached first throughout the entire planet in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and that this was the urban revolution, urban being city civilization, and that this was reached about 3,500 BCE, first in Mesopotamia, nowhere else, no earlier. Later, other cultures, other peoples sort of went through the same stages and reached civilization. For instance, in Egypt, just about the same time, or maybe a century or two later, China, etc. But before 3,500, 4,000 BCE, no civilization. I'm telling you, that story is incorrect, and the progression is incorrect. And I want to show you some of the evidence for that. Then we'll talk about what ended what I call an earlier cycle of civilization that existed at the end of the last ice age. So everything started to change for me when I first went to Egypt. The Sphinx, the traditional view among modern Egyptologists is the Sphinx is about 2,500 BCE. The rise of civilization, as I said, is 3,500 BCE. I go to Egypt 1990, my first trip to Egypt. I go onto the Giza Plateau. There's the Sphinx facing me. The Sphinx, for those who have not been to Egypt, sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It's carved from the limestone bedrock, and it sits largely below ground. And right away, within minutes, literally, I saw as a geologist that there's a problem with the dating of the Sphinx to 2500 BCE. The Sphinx sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. We know geologically the Sahara, for all intents and purposes, has been hyper-arid for about 5,000 plus years. That's essentially as long as civilization supposedly has existed according to the standard paradigm. But I looked at it. One thing you want to know about the Sphinx is, as I said, it sits in its own enclosure. It sits in essentially a pit or a quarry. Why? Because to carve out the body of the Sphinx, they cut out huge multi-ton limestone blocks and moved them out to build what is known as the Sphinx Temple, which you see there. Do you see the person for scale at the gate? That gives you a feel of how big those limestone blocks are. This was constructed at the same time that they were carving the body of the Sphinx. This is actually, in some ways, more incredible than the Sphinx itself. They didn't just chip the rock out and take it away in baskets. They carved out blocks and built these temples. There's a Sphinx with the very ruinous Sphinx Temple right in front of it, and the what's known as the Valley Temple and to the left in the view you're seeing. The second pyramid sits right behind the Sphinx, which is one reason people attributed the Sphinx to 2500 BC, because they said it must have been carved by Khafra, the pharaoh Khafra, who was ruling Egypt around 2500 BC. So they say, oh, he must have ordered the Sphinx to be carved. And they even claimed that the face of the Sphinx was the face of Khafra, which is not true, should we put it that way. So the core body and the closing walls, I saw immediately as a geologist that it shows evidence of water erosion. It shows evidence of water erosion despite the hyper-arid conditions on the Sahara for the last 5,000 years. So right away, it made absolutely no sense to me that this was 2500 BCE. It just did not fit the climate of the time. And when you look at the walls of the enclosure, and you can see in the diagram in the bottom left as you're looking at the slide, that's a diagram showing how water will run down over the rocks, and notice that it gives sort of a rolling, undulating profile, but it also cuts these vertical fissures. Everyone sees that? These vertical fissures, which are very, very diagnostic. When I first presented this at the Geological Society of America annual meeting, a refereed, abstract and presentation, a lot of geologists came up to me and said, this is such simple geology. Why did no one ever notice it before? But historians, Egyptologists, are they geologists? No. And the implications of this simple geology are really profound. So we've got these protracted rains showing up on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure in particular, and also the body. That's a younger me in the bottom right-hand photograph. And that's John Anthony West and me looking at it. Do you see the fissure that we're in? That's how big they are. That's how eroded it is. It's not due to Nile flooding. It's not due to the Sphinx having once sat in a pool of water, as some people have suggested. It actually would not hold water. It's a very karstic, if you know what that is, limestone, very porous. And if it had been floods coming in from below, from Nile flooding, it would undercut the rock much more greatly than it is, because actually the softest layers of limestone are at the base of the walls and the base of the Sphinx. So I've looked into all these things. The Egyptologists say, they've given me dozens of reasons why I'm wrong. Every one of their dozens of reasons is easily negated, should we say. Um, Rain erosion versus wind erosion. You can see in this diagram, what do you get with wind erosion? You get this wind tunnel effect, but it also keeps sharp edges, and you don't get the vertical fissures. One thing you want to realize is the limestone there, like most rocks, at least sedimentary rocks and also many igneous rocks, it's layered, sort of like a layer cake. And so what happens is that the softer layers erode out weather and erode out preferentially. But I hope everyone can see in the diagram the distinction. This is younger me looking at some wind weathering. Here's some real photographs of wind weathering. These are tombs just a few hundred meters away from the Sphinx, carved out of exactly the same limestone as the Sphinx. These tombs are well dated. That means they have hieroglyphics right on them that Egyptologists can read and have read to me, and I've learned a bit myself. And they say exactly who lived there, when, we know when they lived. These are from the 4th dynasty, within, a few generations at most of when supposedly the Sphinx was carved. It's just not possible that these weathered this way, the Sphinx weathered the other way. The Egyptologists, one in particular, who I won't name, Egyptian Egyptologist, he had some geologists from the University of Cairo come out to disprove me and say these were different rocks, they would weather differently, etc. They came back and said, no, Schoch is right. They were never heard from again. I'm not saying anything bad happened to them, but this is wind weathering. You can see it on the upper left there, and then the angular wind tunnel features, and then we see once again the rain weathering with me for scale on the bottom right, the rounded undulating profile. So this is all very nice, and I was impressed by it when I first went there, but I didn't realize. I was a geologist. I am a geologist, and I realized the implications, but I didn't realize how upset people would get over it. Should we put it that way? So my initial dating was pushing the Sphinx back to a pre-Saharan desert period, which we now know the Sahara Desert was lush, end of the last ice age approximately, got drier, but it went through periods of more or less rainfall. So it went through different climatic conditions. And initially I was being, quote, very conservative and pushing it back to maybe 5,000 to 7,000 BCE. The one criticism I actually got from my fellow geologists, even very early on, was that my data actually was more compatible with pushing it back to more around 10,000 BC or so. And I'm happy now actually going with the data as the best fit data and pushing it back, the origins, to at least about 10,000 BCE. But that has real implications, as we'll see, because that puts it before the end of the last ice age. That puts it before the end of the last ice age at 9,700 BCE. But I think that is correct. So a few other things I just want to show you quickly. This is on the Saqqara Plateau. You can see the step pyramid behind it. And if you've been to Egypt, I'm sure you've been to Saqqara Plateau, but you may not have seen these because they're not super impressive. These are mud brick mastabas, dried mud brick. This is not baked mud brick. This is not baked bricks. Even the smallest amount of rain will poof. These will just wash away and degrade, etc. These have been well dated, carbon dating and Egyptological artifacts, etc., at least 28 to 3,000 BC, approximately there. Point is, they're older than the traditional date or the supposed date of the origins of the Sphinx. If this area, because this is not very far from Giza, if this area had had the rain we would need to erode the Sphinx, these guys would not be there. They would not survive. Other things. I've been on the Sphinx. That's me on the back of the Sphinx, at the head of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a little, it's a little misleading because under under the headdress, that's all modern repairs and cement and whatnot. So it's been messed around with, should we say. But when you look at the Sphinx, it's been messed around not just in modern times, but in ancient times. So there are repairs on the Sphinx. Here is my sunburnt hand. I'm putting my hand on some modern repairs to the paws of the Sphinx, but if you look underneath, there's ancient repairs. For all we know, in fact, the evidence indicates that the Sphinx was being repaired in Old Kingdom times, within just a generation or two at the most of when it was supposedly first carved out of the stone. And that really doesn't make sense if you have a meter or more depth of weathering and erosion. How does that happen so quickly, that they're repairing it so quickly, etc.? Again, it's compatible with a much earlier origin for the Sphinx. And this is the Valley Temple. Remember, the Valley Temple was what? Built out of limestone blocks carved when the Sphinx originated. And that is, do you see him, John Anthony West? That's actually him for scale. And what he's doing is he's walking by these blocks. And what we have, and I found this to be incredibly important when I first went to Egypt as a geologist, I could see that there's limestone on the left side. Do you see how there's limestone and then granite veneer? The limestone was heavily weathered. These were ancient, heavily weathered temples. Then granite was put on them. And it turns out there is a tradition in dynastic Egypt of renewing older structures with granite. This granite was then put on it, and you can see, I hope there, that in some cases they literally took the trouble to cut the back of the granite to fit the weathered limestone blocks. Why would you do that? Because this was, even for them, a very ancient sacred site, and they were preserving as much as they could. And can you see it's very eroded in modern times, but on the on the right-hand side, you should be able to see some hieroglyphs. Those have been dated by Egyptologists to the Old Kingdom, more or less about 2500 BCE, when supposedly all of this was built anew. It just makes no sense unless you're talking about older structure that was refurbished and reinvigorated in dynastic times. So all of this evidence, and there's more. We did subsurface seismic testing. I did this with Thomas DeBecke, who is sitting in the middle there. Dr. Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist. My degree is geology and geophysics. Actually, I have 3 degrees in that, but that's another matter. And what we did is we pounded on the rock with a sledgehammer, and you put energy, or you can think of it as sound, going down. It bounces off the layers. It gives you information on the density of the layers. And what I was interested in is subsurface weathering. So this is essentially mineralogical changes that take place as the rock weathers down, 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 down. Everyone makes sense? So it starts when you uncover the surface. And just a side note, when I was doing this initially, I knew better, but I was trying to not get myself in so much trouble maybe with the Egyptologists over 30 years ago. I sort of used a linear extrapolation for the depth of weathering. Everyone makes it? But actually, it's weathering, not erosion. It's mineralogical changes, but as you go down, it slows down. Why? Because you've still got more on top. So it's not actually linear, which is why I initially underestimated the age of the origin. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. And what we found is that the Sphinx is weathered very, very deeply on the 3 sides, the 2 sides and in the front, but much less so in the back, subsurface weathering. And this suggested to me, along with surface data, that the Sphinx initially emerged from the bedrock. It was connected in the back to the bedrock. And when I calibrate properly, I'll say properly now, the data confirms that the major three sides, the core body was carved out about 10,000 BCE at least, maybe a little earlier. I wouldn't put it a whole lot earlier than that personally, but end of the last ice age. And you can see there the area where I show it in red there, that was excavated out later in Old Kingdom times when they refurbished the Sphinx. They cut out the rear and freed it totally from the bedrock. It had only been carved down partially initially. So initially, so my subsurface data confirmed the 10,000 BCE. Ultimately, even though, as I said, my conservative estimate initially was 5,000 to 7,000 using a more linear extrapolation. And based on the seismic, the Sphinx was connected to the bedrock in the rear, which we have other structures throughout ancient Egypt which are built coming out of the bedrock. And interestingly, the Sphinx connected to the bedrock looks out to the sky about 10,000 BCE during the age of what? Leo, on the vernal equinox. And in fact, Leo sort of rises such that Leo is connected to the I won't call it bedrock, connected to the horizon before it rises all up. So maybe this was all quite intentional. The second thing that I noticed literally within the first couple of minutes of going to see the Sphinx in 1990 on my first trip, I was warned by all these people that, oh, you know, be careful because you're going to have like a psychic blackout or something. I don't know. Because the Sphinx is such a powerful and it's such a sacred site. And yes, I actually do feel that. But the first thing I know, maybe it's the second, I don't know, first or second, was the weathering, the incompatible weathering. And the second thing was the head is too small for the body. And the head is, in my opinion, absolutely not the original head. I came to that conclusion very, very quickly, within 10 minutes, that this is a dynastic head. All the Egyptologists would say to me, oh, it's a dynastic head. How can you say that goes back earlier? It's not the original head. It's not what happened. The original head was much bigger. It eroded down. When they tried to repair the body in the Sphinx, it's very difficult to repair a head like that, so they just carved it down further. Does that make sense? And I'm absolutely convinced of that. It's a dynastic recarving. I think it's probably early, very early in dynastic times. That's my guesstimate. And we now have evidence, and I'm not going to go into this in detail here because I have only limited time, but you can go to my website, robertschoch.com, to read more about this. But working with my colleagues, Dr. Manu Saifzadeh first actually came to this realization. Then myself and Robert Vival joined him on a paper talking about it. We now understand that the Sphinx was originally a female lion. A female, not a male. I hypothesized maybe it was a male lion originally, but it's a female. And we believe we know what female lioness it was. It was the goddess, if you would, Mehit or Mehit, who is known from ancient dynastic Egypt. It's a very old deity, and it's a guardian deity. And we now believe that this is what the Sphinx was originally. The Egyptologists were perplexed for a very long time because even though the Sphinx is sitting there, there were really not much in the way of early records of the Sphinx. Well, it turns out they were looking for the wrong thing. It's Mehit that was there. And when you realize that, there are records of a very ancient Mehit on the Giza Plateau going back as far as hieroglyphs are known, basically about 3100 BC or so. There's literally Mehit being mentioned on the Giza Plateau. Well, that's what became the Sphinx. And it also talks about the hieroglyphs, Mehit guarding an archive. She was a guardian lioness. She guarded guarded and archived. Well, what did we find when we did the seismic? Can you see what this is? This is a map looking down on the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is facing toward the right, facing east. Everyone see that? And there's different anomalies. So this is from our seismic work, and the one I want to point out to you now is anomaly A. Anomaly A on the upper right side of the diagram, that is a low velocity zone, which is another way of saying that is a chamber or cavity under the left paw. There's probably a collapsed tunnel running from it. If you look at the B's, anomaly B's, that's probably a collapsed tunnel running from it. Anomaly C is a chamber behind the rump of the Sphinx. It's interesting, we did this, we did not know about the chamber behind the rump of the Sphinx, and we found it seismically, and then the Egyptologists on site, I'm talking Egyptian Egyptologists, say, oh, that's nothing, we already know about that, we've been in it. It's probably, maybe late period, that type of thing. So it shows that our seismic was working. And then we point out there's anomaly A, and they say, no, there's nothing there, nothing there. Well, how do you know? We picked it up. No, and we know there's nothing there. Do you see the irony of that? Yeah. Somehow our seismic was working on the west at the rump, but not under the paws. And I realize now there's reasons they might not want anything to be there, because this is a side note. Have you heard of Edgar Cayce? Yeah, he sort of predicted that there might be a chamber or hall of records under the paws of the Sphinx, so that didn't look good for them if all of a sudden we found it, perhaps. But the point is, it is there. I have no question there's a chamber under the paws of the Sphinx, and it's under actually the left paw, the right paw when you face the Sphinx, and that's what Mahit was guarding a chamber. And when you look at something like this is the Tutmosis IV Dream Stela, which was erected about 1400 BCE. There I am for scale standing next to it. And when you look at this Dream Stela, can you see the two sphinxes on the stela? And what's under the sphinxes? It looks like a building. I now interpret those as chambers. And this also brings up the issue of, is there a second Sphinx somewhere out there? A lot of people believe there is. I think I might know where it is, but that has to be tested before I start talking about it. But the point is that the Sphinx is sitting under a chamber. We did, and I just want to mention, people say, well, if there's a chamber under the Sphinx, how do you enter it? Some people say, oh, this is the doorway. No, this is not the doorway, the stela. We did seismic work also in the sand that sits in front of the Sphinx. Do people see the Sphinx there? I don't have a pointer to use, but there's basically sand and whatnot in front of the Sphinx temple and the Sphinx. We did seismic work there also, and what we found is that there's a cliff face under that sand. So what I believe is the case is that there's probably an entrance in that cliff face under who knows how, under 10 or more meters of sand that goes in and goes into that chamber. Does that make sense to people? Yeah, and there's that's from the Dream Stela, one of the sphinxes sitting above the chamber. And we see diagrams just like this in the hieroglyphs going back to a period before the Sphinx was supposedly built, according to standard Egyptologists. So I was pushing the Sphinx back initially to 5,000 to 7,000 BC. I got in lots of academic trouble for that because the Egyptologists didn't like it, the historians didn't like it. It made all kinds of waves at the time. These are just a few headlines from different newspapers. I once said this as a joke, so I won't try to say as a joke. I know, I once said not as a joke, but everyone laughed. But I really don't tell jokes. I just said I didn't understand the first headline there on the left, scientists clash on the age of the Egyptian Sphinx, because as far as I was concerned, no scientists were clashing on it. It was between geologists who are scientists and Egyptologists who frankly are not scientists. And thank you. And that's not to put them down whatsoever. It's a perfectly wonderful academic discipline. I went to Yale. Yale has Egyptology. They have a famous fellow named Mark Lehner who studied the Sphinx for his dissertation. His name will come up again in a minute. He went to Yale also and got a PhD in Egyptology. I got mine in geology and geophysics. But it did create a stir among Egyptologists. So the geologists were agreeing with me. The Egyptologists weren't fond of this, and they actually arranged in 1992 to have, as part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting, 1992, I was very young back then, debate, so-called debate on the age of the Sphinx. And so I was on the podium. You can't really tell, but I'm up on the podium there in that little picture. And Mark Lehner, who I just mentioned, who has a PhD in Egyptology, his response to me was, and I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I'll be sort of blunt. I thought we were going to debate actual evidence and data. It was really more me trying to present evidence, this is my view, and them basically telling me I'm wrong, and they knew I was wrong, and that was that. Yeah, it was serious. And at one point, I'm showing some of the raw seismic data to one of the, we'll say, opponents, and he's looking at it, and I'm clear that he can't quite figure out what he's looking at. Then I realize he's looking at it upside down. So I turn it around so he can look at it right side up. But it didn't seem to make any difference to him. He still didn't seem to understand. So Mark Lehner said, and this is a direct quote, it was in the New York Times, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where is the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? Because they love broken pottery. And no, I have a degree in anthropology, archaeology. I understand these things. People during that age were hunters and gatherers. Remember the paradigm? Hunters and gatherers. They didn't build cities. That is, they did not have civilization at the time I was talking about. So this was a real conundrum for me. I didn't have a good answer for them. But years later, a few years later, enter Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt. Unfortunately, he died prematurely, but he was with the German Archaeological Institute, and he began excavating around 1995. He began excavating the site of Göbekli Tepe. So Göbekli Tepe near Urfa, which is the traditional home of the biblical patriarch Abraham in southeast Turkey. This is a photograph that Katie, my wife is Catherine Ulysses, Katie, and she took many of these photographs of Göbekli Tepe and elsewhere. Göbekli Tepe, he published very early on that it had major building phases, 10,000 BCE to 8,000 BCE. That was his initial dating. We can think of the older portions of Göbekli Tepe that have been excavated as being roughly 10,000 BCE. They're definitely pre-Ice Age. The site spans the Ice Age, but this is what I had been informally calling Sphinx Age, and my academic colleagues were trying their best to make trouble for me, should we say, or worse, for saying such things. But here was another site, and I want to give a quote. I had the chance to interview him and speak with him. I forget when now. When did we go? 2023? Yeah, 2023, I believe, because I'm working on a documentary with a not-for-profit organization for the research of ancient cultures. We interviewed Professor Dr. Ian Hodder, who is one of the world's experts on the archaeology of Turkey. He was a site director for a very long time at Çaykur, which I'll mention later. And this is a quote from him, a direct quote from him, which he published, that Göbekli Tepe is unbelievably big and amazing at a ridiculously early age, with huge great stones and fantastic highly refined art. Many people think it changes everything. It overturns the whole apple cart. All our theories were wrong. And this is coming from an academic talking basically to other academics, to other, it's not just someone out in the wind. I mean, this is perhaps the most renowned archaeologist, or certainly one of them, but maybe the most in Turkey, for Turkey. So this really is an amazing, important site. If you want to talk about out of time, at least in terms of what we thought, in terms of our paradigm, this just did not fit in. So the site consists thus far of 20 or more megalithic stone circles. Only 4 have been really significantly excavated so far. The others are known from aerial views, from geophysics, that type of thing, using different methods. So it's a really huge site. I'm going to show you a few pictures from different periods in time, because I've been there with Katie a number of times. I went there initially with John Anthony West before he died in 2018. He wanted to see it also, of course. And so this is an aerial view. You see how it's sort of stone circles? Sort of like a bunch of Stonehenges, except Stonehenge, and I'm a geologist, so I love stones, but Stonehenge is made out of these big, rough, crude stones. This is made out of beautifully carved limestone pillars. And there I am, that's 2010. They now have a canopy over it because it's a UNESCO site. And in fact, this canopy is not, it's not helping because it's allowing moisture to collect in its, in my opinion. I'm a geologist. I'd rather see it without a canopy. But there are problems when you excavate a site. Is it now subject to erosion and damage? Yes. But that's what you have to do to learn about. This is 2020. I was actually a bit cold there. It gets very cold there. But you can start to see the site in the background. And it's these incredible pillars and stone rings and circles, just to give you a feel for it a little bit. If you were walking around it today. And this is an older picture of it. Notice the pillar. Notice the beautiful carvings on the pillars. And there has a lot of relief carvings of animals and images, etc. That has this beautiful beast that's carved into the pillar, that's not attached to it separately. Some kind of, people call it a feline or a lizard. Just as a side note, I have shown pictures of this to archaeologists off the record who wanted to stay off the record, and asked them, well, if you found this in isolation, just based on the style, based on the finesse, based on the skill of carving, just off the top of your head, how old do you think it would be? And these were archaeologists, work in the Middle East and in Turkey, etc. One of them said to me, and again, they didn't want to be on the record, one said, oh, maybe 1000 BC. The other one said 600 BC. This is actually 10,000 or so BC. So, I mean, much, much older. Put it this way, the dynastic Egyptians, 2,500 BC versus 10,000 BC. Do your math quickly, 7,500 years between those two, only 4,500 years between us and those Old Kingdom dynastic Egyptians. So this really is old. That's sometimes known as the vulture pillar. I'm not going to go into great detail on all the carvings here. That's not the point at the moment. These are some more of the pillars. The one on the left is actually the first one that was uncovered by the landowners. Do you see how it's sort of broken on the top? They hid it when they were trying to plow and clear the land. They thought they were just going to knock it out, just some old boulder. But no, there's a fox. And do you see the little piglet, if you would, or the little boar underneath? These were used, and they were, I believe, incised and re-incised in some cases. There's other ones. These are some of the T-pillars. I'll come back to that, but do you see how they have arms? And this one has a little animal, like a dog-like animal, under its arm. So Göbekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia, near Urfa. I've marked it on the map there. Interestingly, this is between the Tigris and Euphrates. This is what some people interpret from reading the Judeo-Christian Bible as the area of Eden. Maybe that's significant, maybe it's not, but I think it's interesting. And the date of Göbekli Tepe, going back to before the end of the last ice age, is actually older than my initial dating for the Sphinx. Now, I would put them all about simultaneously at the end of the last ice age. Again, rough numbers, you can think 10,000 BCE. So there I am, or here I am. This is interesting. This is known as Urfaman. And he's now in his own big new museum with his own room, and you can't even get very close to him. Back in the old days on the bottom right, in the smaller museum, you could get up close to him, so I'm just there for scale. But interestingly, Urfa is maybe a half-hour drive, depending on how you drive it, from the site of Göbekli Tepe. Urfa is a big, bustling, modern city. But when they go down, like to build a new parking garage or renovations, they often hit stratigraphic layers, archaeological layers that are Göbekli Tepe time, and Urfaman was found there. I think that, in fact, Urfa may be one of the oldest inhabited cities on Earth, continuously inhabited city. It's a modern city, but it's also a very, very ancient city. And this is what the Göbekli Tepe people at least pictured themselves as looking like, not as some kind of crude, primitive, cavemen types. So here I am discussing with Klaus Schmidt on site about Göbekli Tepe. That's John Anthony West actually in the foreground. This is a picture, must have been from 2010, that Katie took of us. And I was very skeptical going there. I'm one of these people, I would love sites to confirm what I've been saying all along, but I'm not going to jump on the bandwagon unless I am convinced that it's real. And I've rejected a number of things that people have presented to me, say, oh, this confirms you, this helps you. Well, that would be great if it's real or if it's genuine. Not saying that they were faking it, but if they misinterpret something. So I was being very careful, but with Klaus Schmidt, German Archaeological Institute, I thought he was probably on the right track, and he convinced me he was between talking to him, reading all the literature. These stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe, as I said, they're really ornately carved in relief. The largest are at least 10 to 15 tons. So they're quite tall, 4 or 5 meters for the larger ones, but they're very thin and narrow, and they're carved out of limestone. And I will say, as a geologist, to carve them the way they are, these thin, narrow pillars, and move them without snapping them is a whole lot more difficult than moving, say, big Stonehenge rough hewn blocks. He believed that they were set, and this has been confirmed, into the bedrock with a type of concrete, basically 12,000 years ago. This whole site, and people argue about this, but I, as a geologist, am 100% convinced that it was intentionally buried 10,000 or more years ago, probably right at the end of the last ice age. I'll come back to that. And once it was buried, it rains there. It's sort of deserty, but it rains there, and mineralogical changes occur, essentially little stalactites and stalagmites, if you know what they are, like in caves, form on a micro level. You can date those with radiocarbon dating, and you can look at various isotopes in them to get the weather patterns, data on the weather patterns, and it's well-dated site. One problem I had with the Sphinx and the origins of the Sphinx and convincing certain people like Egyptologists is they would continually point out, oh, we find all these dynastic tools around the Sphinx. Oh, we find all this dynastic pottery shards and garbage around the Sphinx. Well, yeah, because they were still using it and reusing and refurbishing it thousands of years later. So am I making sense? This was actually covered over and kept in relatively pristine condition for over 10,000 years until it's been recently excavated. Notice the long, thin arms, the slender fingers around the navel region, and the fox pelt loin cloth. I'll come back to those. We're talking, this is actually, we saw him, I think we saw him just recently on a trip, but the landowners, it's now government property was sort of taken over, and now they protect it and care for it. But we were talking to him, and he picks up things, and he was showing us a little, we'll call it an arrowhead, little point that he had just found. Okay, it looks relatively primitive and crude, right? Someone say yes. Yeah. But on the other hand, I still remember the days, maybe we don't do it much anymore, I remember the days still using chalk on a chalkboard, which has been used for a whole long time, while I'm also using a computer at the same time. Do you see my point? Yeah, so this doesn't prove that they were primitive or crude, because then you look at something like this, which he also handed me, and that is my hand, but I had to give it back to him. This is a beautiful little bead he had just found, and of course now it's in the museum collection. And if you look at it, I don't know if you can see it there, but it's drilled through the long way at a essentially millimeter level. How do you do that 12,000 years ago with, quote, just primitive tools, et cetera, et cetera? To me, as a geologist, this is just as incredible, if not more so, than some of the carving on a megalithic scale. So there's a lot going on there. So the major distinguishing characteristics by which archaeologists typically identify true civilization. So a little lesson here in archaeology, if you would. They look for things like monumental stone architecture. They look for city or urban life to distinguish true civilization. They look for writing and literacy. So one question we can pose is, does Göbekli Tepe and the people of Göbekli Tepe fit the definition, the classic definition of civilization? And I would contend that they have all these characteristics, including literacy, 6,000 years before civilization was supposedly first on Earth, before civilization supposedly first arose, according to the conventional view. So it really upsets the time frame. Now, let me go into a little more detail on that. One thing I will say is that I was talking to, I don't know if he's here now, I don't want to name names without getting permission, but I was talking to an academic colleague even at this conference, or maybe it was before the conference, we were exchanging emails, and he was pointing out, well, how do you do some of these amazing feats without having some level of literacy and recording and giving instructions to people? So it almost seemed like, well, to do this, you have to have that, but that's not direct evidence. But I would contend we have direct evidence for all of these features. So Göbekli Tepe, can we agree, certainly has monumental stone structures. Yeah, I mean, you can see those to this day. Settled urban life, I would contend that, if nothing else, should we say, maybe we haven't found it, but I think we maybe have found at least one of the cities of the Göbekli Tepe people, because it's still there, Urfa, where Urfa Man was found. We still have that city. We just can't excavate the whole thing because there's hundreds of thousands of people living there, and they don't want to excavate it, understandably. And there's also lots of Greek and Roman ruins and whatnot. Katie and I have been there many times. And for instance, in one area, they were going to build, I forget what, maybe it was extension to a museum or something. But they start, our parking lot, and they start digging. They find all these beautiful Roman mosaics. Well, you can't just destroy those. Now there's a museum over it. But you get my point. But did they have writing? Many archaeologists will say, well, that's the key. They have to have writing. I think they, in fact, were literate, not just theoretically, but I do think we have some evidence for that. I contend, and this is something that I've worked on with, and I want to give him a lot of credit for it, Dr. Manu Saifzadeh, and he and I have worked on this together. He initiated it. Looking at the so-called symbols or decorations at Göbekli Tepe, like the belt. That's the belt on one of the famous pillars on Göbekli Tepe. Do you see what it looks like? It looks like sort of in our letters, a C, a H, a backward C. Okay, I'm not saying that they spoke English or anything, but I also contend that that's probably not just random patterns in decoration, because you see these repeated patterns throughout the limited corpus, that is the limited amount of possible writing we have on the pillars, because we have such a small amount. But if you start looking at this, we think this means God. We don't just say that randomly, because in the same region there were the Hittites. Have people heard of the Hittites? And the so-called Luwian hieroglyphs, but yes, are thousands of years later than Göbekli Tepe. Absolutely, I don't dispute that. But on the other hand, it looks to us like there was a certain traditions passed on, and that certain, there's some evolution in the hieroglyphs, or maybe something was survived. This, for instance, is Luwian for God. Do you see this? How similar it is? And there was a famous, it's very well, those who are interested in this know this Emmanuel Laroche, and he wrote a monograph on the hieroglyphs of the Hittites, or what's now known Luwian. This is some of his Laroche symbols. They're numbered because these are the numbers he gave them. So if you look at them, like 184 refers to the divine, 239 is a gate or portal or passage, 360 means God, 411 a connection to God or the gods. And you start seeing these repeated at Göbekli Tepe, but even though it's thousands and thousands of years earlier, and they seem to be repeated systematically. So my personal reading of this belt, which you now see in full on one side there, the one side, I think that's probably being, this is my hypothesis, reading from right to left. What do some languages still read right to left? Yeah, of course. May have been the original way to have writing. I think my hypothesis is that this says God of gods, and that this is a God symbol, and it ties in. Here, if you look at this, do you see the symbols there? It's sort of tilted on its side, the H in the God symbol. You see that? I think this may mean path or the way of the God. This is also a solar or plasma configuration, so I want you to hold that thought for later in the talk. But I don't think this is just random symbolism. You see another H on the bottom of that pillar, turned on side? What we would say turned on side. So I think that, and there's more I could go into, but I think they actually were literate. So they meet all the requirements that are standardly given to acknowledge true civilization at such an early period. Other signs of sophistication, this is from a paper by Peters and Schmidt, and there's on the bottom, that's Katie's composite view of Göbekli Tepe when we were there very early on before they built the canopy over it. And if you look at the upper right-hand corner, what you will see is a map that Peters and Schmidt did with it. You can see that it's the rings of Göbekli Tepe. This is an aerial view. And when you look down at Göbekli Tepe, you have these rings of pillars. And then in each ring, you have a central pair of pillars. Everyone see that? And those central pairs of pillars are very accurately oriented, I believe. If you see the black lines, those are what I drew in to show the orientation. So north is to the top, and they're oriented to south and slightly east. Does everyone see that? But they're not oriented all the same way. And what I believe is going on is that they were tracking precession of the equinoxes. They were looking out towards the sky, and this is my analysis of it, towards the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion on the vernal equinox. And what's happening is that they had to build and rebuild as these very slow precessional changes make it that they have to reorient. Am I making sense? Yeah, so they're looking at these slow precessional changes and reorient it over a couple of thousand years. And interestingly, the archaeologists have dated enclosure D, which is at the top, and then you go closure D, C is in the middle on the right, then B and on the middle left, and then A in the bottom. They have stratigraphically and otherwise dated these enclosures as being the oldest at the top and progressively D, B, C, D, C, B, A. And when you look at the precessional changes in orientation, it gives you the same order. Does that make sense? So I really think this is very strong. And it shows they were aware of precession thousands and thousands of years before supposedly anyone knew about it. I mean, we're talking, the classic view is no one knew about it before maybe 600, 700 BCE, not 10,000 BCE. So a lot going on. So they're looking out at Taurus and Orion. This is, we put this together looking sort of south and slightly east to Orion rising on the horizon on the vernal equinox. And there you see Taurus and the Pleiades. I don't know if anyone knows the passage. There's a passage in the Judeo-Christian Bible talking about God being up in the Pleiades. But anyway, it was a very important, I think, going back to a very early period, and there's evidence for that this was a very important region of the sky. And you can think of Orion with his belt stars. Think of the pillar with the belt. And Orion, the pillar, the belt stars. And what does Orion travel with? He travels with his companion dog, the dog star, Sirius. So I think this may be represented in part in the pillars. Is that making sense to people? Yeah. And remember, there's twin pillars. One suggestion is that precession, and I'm going out on a limb here, but it's good to speculate sometimes and then see if you can confirm the data, confirm with data. Twin pillars, could that be the sun and the earth and our solar system and Sirius? Because some people suggest that we are in a binary system with another star, and that other star may be Sirius. Do you realize that most stars, it's been estimated now in our galaxy, are binary pairs? And some people suggest that binary pairing of our sun with maybe Sirius could be what causes precessional changes. So a lot going on here. So what could wipe out an advanced civilization? Something that people like Klaus Schmidt said and other archaeologists, and I would say, is that after Göbekli Tepe, even a millennium or less, and certainly 2 millennia after Göbekli Tepe, you don't have anything like it. It goes back down. It goes into what I call a dark age, and I'll come back to that. But what could wipe out advanced civilization? This is definitely before the time of the height of Göbekli Tepe, before the end of the last ice age. So it was followed by catastrophe. There was a catastrophe. It was followed by intentional burial. Look at this. Do you see the pillar on the left in the back? You can see how it was broken, knocked down, and then was hastily re-erected. Does everyone see that? On piles, and they put in these crude stone walls to sort of keep everything together. It's almost like they're building initially a fallout shelter or a bunker, if you think of it that way. And you see how the other pillar was cracked, and you keep looking at this. This is not archaeological reconstruction in modern times. Look at this with the cute little boar's head, but the crude blocks built up right up against it. I don't believe for a second that they were carving these beautiful stone structures to simply the next day build crude walls against them. Some archaeologists have said, okay, that was intentionally buried, but that was part of their ritual. They would build this huge thing, put all this work into it, and then bury it as some kind of weird ritual. I don't think the evidence is there, in part because some of the pillars, and Klaus Schmidt noticed this too before he died, some of the pillars look like they've been used and reused because they actually show weathering on their surfaces that wouldn't have occurred once it was buried and protected. So Göbekli Tepe probably spans several thousand years before the end of the last ice age when all is said and done. There, look at that. Do you see sort of not middle, but slightly to your left? Here's a closer view. Do you see how it was piled up and put into position and then packed with stones, and then the whole site was packed over? I just want to point out that there has been a controversy among some people as to whether this site was really intentionally buried. I am 100% convinced it was. As a geologist, I looked at the stratigraphy very carefully, and now we have other sites with like Karhan Tepe, which I've had the chance to visit also, where even those archaeologists independently have talked about how it was intentionally buried. They would put in rubble fill, then they would cover it over with flat stones and put in more rubble fill. This was not just wind and sand blowing in like we have this in the Sphinx enclosure. You can distinguish that geologically and stratigraphically. Coming to Egypt, though, it's interesting. Katie, my wife, had pointed out to me when we were in Egypt that, well, we've been looking at Göbekli Tepe and the intentional burial, but it looks like parts of Egypt were intentionally buried too, but they didn't have the rocks that you have in Turkey, and they used mud brick quite a bit. So we may have something similar in Egypt for some of the sites, and we've seen evidence, she and I have seen evidence at Karnak and Hawara, Esna, Edfu, Kwambo, Osari, at the Osirian, and she first got the idea from looking at a diagram like this. This is from the 19th century at the Visitors Center going into Karnak, and you can see what it looked like back in the 19th century. And then when you start looking at, when I say you can see what looked, you see the rubble piles, etc. Yeah, was that just the way it fell down, or was there some intention there? And then when you look at places like this is Edfu, the temple of Edfu. You've got this incredible, beautiful temple, but you've got all this mud brick packing around it. Am I making sense? So was that intentional to protect an older structure, et cetera? This is something else I just want to mention here. This is Kamombo, but it may be very analogous to what we see in Göbekli Tepe. Katie is wonderful at making observations, and then I have to spend quite a bit of time, shall we say, looking into the data to see if it's good. You can't just speculate. Well, I can't just speculate without finding evidence for or against it. Am I making sense? Yeah, but you need to. It's good that I get spurred on. Göbekli Tepe was, I am convinced, intentionally buried, as some of these other sites were, and they, according to Schmidt, spent as much time intentionally burying it as they did to build it. And the question is why? And this brings us to the end of the last ice age. I want to say that some of those walls that they used, remember I showed you the packing walls between the pillars? Some of those walls have plaster on them or had plaster on them, which could be radiocarbon dated. You could look at, there's been isotope studies of them too to try to get weather conditions, and the conclusions were that they go back to the Younger Dryas. The carbon dates some of them put it just at 9700 BCE. I feel very confident that what you're seeing, that catastrophe and that breakage and that reconstruction, crude reconstruction, and then burial spans the end of the last ice age, that the original structure goes back earlier. No question in my mind from a geological, geophysical point of view. So we're talking about the end of the last ice age. As many of you know, we're talking about really the Younger Dryas, the last 1200. I will use the dating of 10,900 BCE for the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Some people say 10,800, but I'm basing it primarily on the sediment and Iceland Greek cores, which as a geologist I think are the most accurate. And then it's actually been agreed geologically where the golden spike is for the end of the last ice age, and the best date for that is almost exactly in 9700 BCE in ice cores. So what Younger Dryas is a period of cooling after what was starting to be a warming period. Many of you have heard about that or know about that. So it's this cold snap, if you would, for 1,200 years, and then the final warming, which brings us out of the last ice age, is at 9,700 BCE, which Göbekli Tepe time. At Göbekli Tepe and the Sphinx, origins of the Sphinx, go back to that period, just before 9,700 BCE. So here is just a little diagram from environmental science textbook that actually I'm a co-author on. It's showing diagrammatically how on the left-hand side it was very cold. It's a logarithmic scale, but it's very cold and was warming. Then so you see how it goes down? That's the cold snap, that's the Younger Dryas, and then incredible warming. Now the thing is, how fast was that incredible warming bringing us out of the last ice age? When I was a graduate student at Yale, we said, oh, it was incredibly fast. But we were talking geologically. Incredibly fast would be, a couple of centuries or something. Oh, if you said, a few decades, maybe I wouldn't have gotten through graduate school. But now we know, and this first came out in 2008, this particular paper, high-resolution Greenland ice core data show abrupt climate change happens in a few years. They narrowed it down that we came out of the Younger Dryas, we came out of the Ice Age in only a few years. That was incredible. But then in 2014, look at this paper. What you see here is a microstratigraphic analysis of the data, and you see the gray blocks on top, and it says Younger Dryas? That's the last 3 years of the Younger Dryas, reading from right to left. Everyone with me? And then the first year of the Holocene, or post-Ice Age, and that's 1 year. So this is showing you 4 years. Look at the Ice Age. It ends, and you can pick this up isotopically, it ends where that bar is. Everyone see that? More or less, it ended in a couple weeks at most, probably literally overnight. So we really are talking instantaneous, really fast. And the question is, what could cause that? So there's these two major events. Something initiates the cold snap beginning at 10,900 BCE, 12,900 years ago. Some people suggest that's a comet. I know I'm in a world where a lot of people like comets for that, and I feel like, don't attack me now. I don't think it was a comet. I don't think it was a comet, a meteor, or asteroid, and I put there, this has been questioned. Well, I've questioned it, other people have questioned it, but something did happen catastrophically. And I want to point out that I think it was solar at both the beginning and the end of the Younger Dryas, but I want to say that there's a lot of good work done by people who have advocated a comet, looking at things like microspherules, black mass, evidence of fire, shocked quartz, nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum group, anomalies, etc. And I am convinced as a geologist and geophysicist that all of that data, where it's sound and good, is also compatible with a solar outburst. Am I making sense? So I'm not putting down the data, it's just we interpret certain data differently. And then I think there's data that you have to invoke a solar outburst. So I actually think solar outburst is much more parsimonious, to use that term, fits the data better. And then the question about comets really has been for the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Very few people have actually addressed the end of the Younger Dryas, 9,700 BC, the actual end of the last ice age, and that's really been my primary focus, which I'm 100% convinced is a solar outburst, major solar outburst. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk about that a little more. I just want to point out a couple of things in case you hadn't heard. A couple of years ago, the Hiawatha crater in Greenland was found, and a lot of people said, "Oh, immediately this proves the Younger Dryas comet hypothesis." Well, it turns out, I'm sure many of you have heard this, if not all of you, the Hiawatha crater, did it prove it? No, because it turns out the Hiawatha crater is Paleocene. That is, it's been dated to about 58 million years ago. So 58 million years earlier than the end of the last ice age. I'm not laughing at anyone because until you get the date, you don't know. Although I had been skeptical about it all along. Then there's things like the Carolina Bays, and again, I don't want to put anyone down, but I'm certainly not convinced that the Carolina Bays have anything to do, collectively at least, with the Younger Dryas. End of story. Now, what created the Carolina Bays, I do not know, and I feel that I learned from the best at both George Washington as an undergraduate and Yale as a graduate that when you don't know something, you admit you don't know something, and that opens for more evidence, more research, etc. I really don't know, and I have not studied the Carolina Bays firsthand, but from the literature and from I've looked at the sedimentology of them, etc., this diagram shows dating on Carolina Bays, and this is using, in particular, optically stimulated luminescence. Essentially, when you have quartz grains and other types of crystals, they all have radioactivity in them. They pick up radioactivity from the environment that causes them to basically have trapped charges or energy, and that will be lost when they're exposed to light or they're exposed to heat, for instance, in pottery, making pottery, etc. But when they're covered over, they're protected. So you can go and you can collect them carefully, scientifically, take them to a lab, then release that energy, measure it. Am I making sense? Crudely, and you can get how long they must have been protected, how long they're, so it gives you some minimum dates. And when this has been done for Carolina Bays, whatever the Carolina Bays are, you get this spread of well over 100,000 years for different bays. Am I making sense? If they were all just one comet, they wouldn't, or even one solar outburst, they wouldn't have this huge spread. So they're very interesting geologically, and I'm not putting down research on them, but they're not applicable, I think, to the Younger Dryas. So as you know where I'm coming from, if not a comet, what? I think that it's solar outbursts at both the beginning and the end of the last ice age. The sun, I think all the science now points to our sun. And the sun is sometimes quiet, sometimes it's not. Something that's very interesting about the sun is that some astrophysicists and astronomers have commented that in a way, not just in the popular imagination, but even in the scientific community, the sun is sort of a last vestige of Aristotelian thinking. And what I mean by that is so many people think of the sun as being essentially unchanging. And then people like Galileo and the Chinese before him found that there were sunspots. Okay, so it's not a perfect ball of fire in the sky or whatever. But you know, even in modern times, people don't think of the sun being super active or really changing. Well, no, the sun is a star, and stars can be very variable. They can go through different periods, which might not be a big deal from their perspective, the star's perspective, but what they do can be a huge deal to a civilization like us. Am I making some sense? So I want to build on that. So I think everything points to the sun. The sun is not as stable as people believe. It's not this Aristotelian perfect thing in the sky, and I believe that a massive solar event, a solar outburst, is what ended the last ice age, and as I'll come to, also began the Younger Dryas. So the sun, what's the primary elements in the sun? Helium, but even more so hydrogen, right? Hydrogen at high temperatures, etc., it can be dissociated. Hydrogen's proton with electron around it, it can be dissociated just into a positive proton, just a negative electron. They can be ejected off, move at fast speeds. You've got the solar wind, etc. A general name for that is plasma. So when I'm talking plasma, that's what I'm talking about, not blood plasma. It's actually named after blood plasma because it sort of acts like it's, plasma physicists will tell you, it acts like it's alive. there may be some truth to that in the sense of, consciousness of the plasma, et cetera. I mean, but that's another metaphysical thing we can talk about later. But that's what I'm talking about, plasma. Think of primarily protons, electrons moving at intense speeds, sometimes subluminal, very close, good percentage of the speed of light. You can have major plasma outbursts from the sun. We call them things like coronal mass ejections or micronovas, when it throws out material in all directions. You can have major solar flares. You can have what are known as proton events, or SPE, solar proton or solar particle events. And these things happen. We know they happen. There was a major one in 1859 known as the Carrington event, named after Richard Carrington, the astronomer who was studying the sun and first saw the initial flare coming off the Carrington event. Greenland ice core data picks this up, sediment core data, and it all indicates that there was a major events of the sun and a major warming again at 9700 BCE. So you can think of pretty sort of plasma and the solar wind coming in, it hits the atmosphere and forms things like the auroras, the aurora borealis, aurora australis. Did anyone see that we had some severe solar activity recently? I say severe from a human perspective, nothing from an astrophysical perspective, what the sun really could do. And you see these. And so this is just a NASA diagram showing the energetic particles coming in. Can you see the little Earth there? Of course, this is not to scale. The Earth is much further away, much smaller if it were to scale. Someone who first talked about what I'm talking about is the astrophysicist Thomas Gold, who's unfortunately now deceased, and he was a brilliant prize-winning astrophysicist, but he suggested that the sun could undergo major disruptions, major solar outbursts. And he suggested this back in the early 1960s. So this is a quote from one of his papers. He said, in the case of a, quote, big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. That's what he called plasma. They called it gas back then. Plasma, the charged particles, and it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level, and he said it would take the form of a series of sparks burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he talked about how it would cause massive destruction on the surface of the Earth. So think of like huge lightning bolts hitting in certain areas, even as people are seeing auroras and disruptions all over the place. And one thing he suggested is that you look for vitrification. What is vitrification? It's when you have really intense heat. I mean, in some cases, you're talking tens of thousands of degrees Celsius hitting the surface of a rock. It melts it, sort of flash melts it, and then it recongeals and forms a natural glass. And he actually started looking for this. Vitrification is hard to find on Earth. At best, you're going to find, like, in many cases, little spherules or little fragments, but it weathers away very quickly, erodes away very quickly. But what do we have, fortunately, attached to the Earth, going around the Earth? Come on. The moon. And Thomas Gold actually looked at lunar samples and lunar data, and he published as far back as 1969, based on the early Apollo missions to the moon, that he found what he called some glazing, vitrification that is apparently due to radiation heating. It suggests a giant solar outburst, I'm quoting him, in geologically recent times. Geologically recent times being translated into our language, end of the last ice age. And so there's photographs of it because it's preserved on the moon and he could find it. because, you don't have the same weathering conditions. But if you look closely, and other people have now been looking closely, you can find vitrification on Earth. Some of this may go back to earlier periods of solar activity. So, for instance, in Libyan desert glass, the Libyan desert glass, which is actually in Egypt, it's in the Libyan desert in Egypt. This is a picture from either I or Katie took it in the Geological Museum in Cairo. But for 2,500 square kilometers, you have this strewn field of this glass. Or in the Western Desert, you have another strewn field of 400 square kilometers of Dockley glass. Do you see how it's glass? It's very crude. It sort of looks like cinder or scoria or slag, but that's what it is. Melted and recongealed. This is very classic bubbly. Well, there's people, geologically, they've usually just not dismissed it, but it must be a comet or a meteor or something, but there's no evidence of that. And when you have these huge fields of it, that's much more parsimonious, I would say, much more economical. Say, no, this is from a solar outburst and hitting and melting. You don't have craters associated with it, etc. And there's been now analysis of fulgurites. You know what fulgurite is? It's where lightning hits the rock or hits sand or hits soil, and it melts it, it recongeals, it makes these mineral composites that are known as fulgurites. So you can people literally chase lightning to see where it hit and then get the samples. And when they've done this is a work by Michael Joseph in particular in this case, I'll sort of summarize his quote there. He's pointed out that what you find in fulgurites is also what you find in a lot of these glasses, natural glasses that have been found that people have suggested are meteorites or asteroid or cometary genesis, but no, you get them from lightning strikes also. So this is why I'm saying that a lot of this data that's being used to support a comet hypothesis is also compatible with a solar outburst. Or, for instance, shock lamellae in rocks and associated types of features. It's now been demonstrated that experimentally in the lab and also in the field where you chase lightning, major lightning, etc., that this can come from lightning. A generation of shock lamellae and melting in rocks by lightning-induced shock waves and electrical heating. You don't need comets and the like to get some of this data. Am I making sense? Yeah. So anyway, again, and vitrification on Earth, I've tried to look at this myself in many places. So the motive mark, which is sort of what they call a dark age fort, you have vitrification there. Here I am in Scotland, and there I'm holding in my hands. Can you see the bubbling and vitrification? This is the motive mark. It's usually considered Dark Age, time of King Arthur. You've heard of King Arthur? And some of the legends that they lived in glass castles. This is the glass castle. No, literally, they knew what they were talking about. This is glass, but they weren't building these. It turns out these go back to essentially the end of the last ice age or so. That's been shown archaeologically. They're very old. They were reused in the Dark Ages, like 500, 600 AD. Am I making sense? So you have that. On the Giza Plateau, we have the Sphinx. Remember the Sphinx? There is evidence that the Sphinx was hit by lightning itself. We have at the Temple of Isis in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, this stela was found. It's sometimes known as the inventory stela, and it literally says it's an ancient stela, but not that ancient. What I mean by that is most people say, oh, it's maybe 600, 500 BC, somewhere in that range, BCE, 1200, 2,500 years old or somewhere like that. But what it purports to be is a copy of a much earlier description. And what it says is that Khufu, who supposedly built the Great Sphinx, that Khufu actually Khufu actually was there, and I'm sorry, Khufu, who supposedly had the Great Pyramid built, was actually there and looking at the Sphinx and looking at a thunderbolt because the Sphinx had been hit by lightning. Am I making sense? You follow what I say? So this is from a quote from Salim Hassan, one of the great classic 20th century Egyptologists. And he said, if we could believe its inscription, we should have to credit Khufu with having repaired the Sphinx. Now, Khufu supposedly was the pharaoh, as I said, who built or had built the Great Pyramid, which was supposedly older than the Sphinx. So how could he be repairing something that wasn't even built at the time? Having repaired the Sphinx, apparently after it had been damaged by a thunderbolt. And Hassan goes on to say, as a matter of fact, there may be a grain of truth in this story, for the tail of the Neme's headdress is certainly missing. There is actually to be seen on the back of the Sphinx a scar of the breakage. Therefore, it is perhaps likely that the Sphinx was struck by lightning, but there is not a particle of evidence to show that this accident happened in the reign of Khufu. And if you look at the actual inscription, I don't think it happened in the reign of Khufu. He was looking at ancient evidence much earlier than him. So he's already, according to this inscription, the Sphinx is there. It had been hit by a thunderbolt, lightning, plasma strike. Everyone with me? And I think he was repairing it. As we know, the Sphinx was repaired. There it goes. And we now have evidence, I'm convinced, of actual vitrification on the Giza Plateau. This is some of it. I'm sitting there by it, and this is on the top, on the left side. There you see me with some of it. On the right side, you see me with some. It's sort of under me. That's the mortuary, so-called mortuary temple of the Second Pyramid. And, went too fast. There we go. And we have not only Scoria, but we also have, if you know what they are, Lichtenberg patterns under the pyramids. They seem to spread out from under the pyramid. When lightning or electrical discharge hits certain substances, you've probably all seen it. It makes like a dendritic pattern or a fractal pattern going out, or that's what do you see that there? That's what I'm convinced, have now. And it looks like this plateau was hit by major lightning strikes, but I don't believe atmospheric lightning. I think from a solar outburst. This may be why it's a sacred site. The Sphinx was possibly already there, was hit by it, but this made the whole site even more sacred. They built the pyramids on top of it. I'm convinced that there's probably older structures under the pyramids, but that's another story. And I want to point out, I've got a little note to remind myself that there's other places where you get this same pattern of a major lightning strike in very ancient times, and then monuments built on top of it, ancient structures. One is at Callanish, or also known as Callanay in Scotland, where you have a megalithic structure built on what geophysically we now understand to have been a place where a major plasma or major lightning strike hit. So a lot of evidence to put that all together. So aside from all the isotope data, the moon data, the lunar data, the ancient vitrification, we also have petroglyphs as part of the archaeological record, which I think undoubtedly points to solar events and not impactor events, if I could use that term. Although one could argue that maybe impactor and solar events could be occurring somewhat simultaneously. Why are the lights going? So anyway, we have microspheres, like I said, biomass, black mats, all of that is compatible with a solar event, and plasma discharges hitting the surface can also cause craters. I want to point that out. We know that both from laboratory data and from actual physical, natural phenomena. Because I don't know if you realize that even small, not that small, but atmospheric lightning strikes, can they cause craters? Absolutely. This has been demonstrated. I mean, it's been observed in cases where a huge lightning bolt hits, say, a parking lot, and then there's a big crater there, etc. And again, the atmospheric lightning bolt like that is nothing compared to what we're talking about in geologic time. So other evidence. This brings in Dr. Anthony Perrott, who is now retired and no longer actively working on this to the best of my knowledge. But when I first met him in about 2000, he certainly was, and he had started publishing on it. He is arguably one of the most renowned plasma physicists in the world studying such things, and he was at Los Alamos National Laboratory for certainly much of his career, and he was studying high energy plasma physics and what would occur when plasma discharges would hit different surfaces, what would occur when they hit the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. And Los Alamos is in New Mexico for recreation, maybe. He would go out and look around and look at petroglyphs. Everyone knows what petroglyphs are. It's not advancing for me. Come on. I can't get to advance. Oh, there we go. And he started seeing in the petroglyphs the same patterns he was seeing in the plasma lab with these huge experiments of high discharge plasma and computer simulations of what should occur, and that makes very distinct shapes, and he was seeing these on the petroglyphs. It's think of the northern and southern lights being on, very, very, very intense, some people would say on steroids. And he started seeing these patterns, but also engraved on ancient petroglyphs. And he and his colleagues got so interested in this, they start looking around in over 130 countries and finding the same patterns. One of the definitive patterns is, some people call it squatter man, but it looks sort of like a human with the legs and the hands up and the head, but these circles on the side. Do you see that? Real humans don't have that, yet he would find this around the world. What that is what's known as synchrotron radiation that you would see in a plasma discharge situation. And I can't get this to, there we go. And this is just a few pictures, nothing as intense as we would have at the end of the last ice age or even earlier than that. But do you see how it starts to take on shapes? In nature, as you have stronger discharges, in the upper atmosphere from maybe a major solar, wind coming in. Come on. I'm AV people. I'm having real maybe the battery is dying on me. Let me try that one. Thank you very much. This is a graphic illustration from Dr. Perrott. Showing it. These are some of his different diagnostic shapes. Notice that you have stick figure men with dots on their sides, stick figure men with birds' heads, cascading donut-like cylindrical shapes. Just sort of get these in your mind. And then when you start looking, these are some of his illustrations. Do you see how you get them around the world in all these different countries? Are they just all hallucinating the same thing with these floating dots on their sides? Or, as he suggests, and I certainly suggest, they were looking up at the sky and seeing these things happen as there was a major solar outburst. Everyone with me? Notice bottom left, I love those, the stick figure men with the birds' heads, because that is very similar to, if you look in the middle here on the bottom, how some of it would take a shape that looks like a bird's head on a stick figure. And then it goes on, and these are some of them, and then some of them go into multiple, what look like arms, but that has to do, again, with the plasma configuration. Here's from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. These are from Dr. Perrott again. Look, there you see some of the stick figure men with birds' heads, and these are some that Katie and I saw in Norway when I was there giving a presentation and doing some field work. Again, the same type of thing, and these are well dated. These particular ones, well dated, right to the end of the last ice age. They're on where the glaciers scraped by. as the Ice Age was ending. We go to Easter Island, a place I love, in part because, Katie and I were married there, maybe, but it's just a fascinating area. And of course, it has the moai that everyone knows about, but it also expands Dr. Perrot's work, because there in this tiny little remote island, 2,000 kilometers from other inhabited land, you have not just the moai, but you have bird-headed men. You have these incredible petroglyphs of bird-headed men there. That's chalked in the 1920s, so you can see it well. Does that sound familiar, the bird-headed? And you have what's known as the Rongo script, which is considered one of the great mysteries of linguistics because no one can interpret it or read it. But if you look at it closely, and the first person I know who did this was Katie, my wife, and she noticed that the Rongo script looks a whole lot like the petroglyphs that Dr. Perrot was studying and the plasma configurations. And in fact, this discovery of hers was confirmed when we first published it by a member of his team who wrote us an email and said, yes, they had figured that out also, but they hadn't published it yet. So she was absolutely correct. And they talked about how, yes, you see all the same distinct shapes in the Rongo. And essentially, you can think of the Rongo as essentially scientific text, maybe, of what was happening in the sky as the sun is undergoing different outbursts, and maybe the sciences show ahead of time. It could be very important. Now, I'm not claiming these Rongo tablets go back to the end of the last ice age. Absolutely not, physically. But even the Easter Islanders in the 19th century, when they were first known to Europeans, the Rongo tablets, they said that they couldn't, quote, read them, but they said they had something to do with the sky. And they also indicate they were copies of copies. They keep copying them over and over, just like manuscripts. I don't know if you realize that, but some of Plato's writings, undoubted writings by Plato, the earliest versions we have are only, medieval. They don't go back to Plato 1,000 years earlier than the manuscripts themselves are 1,000 years later, at the earliest for some of them. Rongo seems to be connected to the Nazca glyphs, which may in fact record exactly the same thing, maybe even were branded, if you would, by the sun on the surface. The Birdman certainly appears elsewhere, including Göbekli Tepe on the so-called vulture pillar and other places. So we think we have a real story here. And you see these plasma petroglyphs around the world. That's in North Ireland on the left, Göbekli Tepe in the middle on the right side. And look at this fellow from Australia. Do you see how he has something very similar on him? And remember I said to keep in mind when I was talking about the writing at Göbekli Tepe, it's also plasma symbolism. Can symbols have more than one meaning at one time? Yeah. And could God have something to do with the sun for ancient people? Or even for modern people? Yes. So here's eyes gazing at the sky from Francis Mézières. He recorded long before I was thinking about this, 1963, an Easter Island legend, the days of Roko Hitau, one of the legendary kings, that the sky fell down and it came back. I won't read this whole thing now, but it describes essentially what we could say was a plasma event, changes in the sky and then coming back to normal. So I think that these are examples. This all supports that there were these huge plasma events, huge solar outbursts. The so-called handbags, some people think those are handbags in the vulture pillar. I want to throw out the hypothesis that maybe it's actually arcing, magnetic or plasma arcing on the sun, which during a major solar outburst, maybe you could even see it by the naked eye, or maybe they had methods to be aware of that. So I think all the evidence is that there's an intense solar outburst, and I just covered it a little bit, at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC. I think this is what drove it to extinction. This is just the title of a paper by Perrott and his colleague, Yale. Evidence for intense solar outburst in prehistory. This is the late Paul Laviolette, who I knew. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, and he also published in Radiocarbon a paper talking about solar evidence, solar flares. They referred to it in tie-in with the mass extinction, and he too talked about how there was evidence for both the beginning and the end of the Younger Dryas, major solar activity. Since then, I've been talking about this since 2010, first published in the 2012 edition of Forgotten Civilization, which has now come out as expanded and revised edition. Since that time, since 2010, 2012, there's been a number of studies now of solar activity in the past since the end of the last ice age. These are just a sampling. We now know that the sun undergoes these periods of incredible activity. All of these events listed here, and there's more still. Research continues, would be larger than the Carrington event, not as strong as what ended the last ice age, but all of these would wipe out modern civilization probably, because we're so dependent on electronics. So solar outbursts, as I said, I think can account for both the beginning and the end of the last ice age. Some people say, well, how could cause a cooling spell? And I was perplexed by this for a very long time because, asteroid or a comet throwing debris up into the atmosphere, sort of a nuclear winter type scenario, blocking the sun, that's understandable, cooling period. But why would a solar outburst? What we find is there's evidence for solar outburst at that time. Laviolette, in particular, published really good data on that. And then in 2018, I'm looking down at the screen here, 2018, this work came out, how very strong evidence based on isotope data and foraminifera, these little microscopic organisms, etc., that there were massive changes in circulation patterns in the ocean, especially the northern oceans, northern hemisphere oceans in the Atlantic, etc., that changed climatic patterns and set off the Younger Dryas, or this could be what set off the Younger Dryas. And what would cause these changes in ocean patterns? They came to the conclusion, and I agree with it based on the data, that there were major floods, major deglacial floods, major dumping of fresh water into the oceans. What would cause that? We know that there were huge backed up lakes that were blocked by ice dams on the continents at the very end of the last ice age during the Younger Dryas. Everyone with us? Those ice dams broke essentially instantaneously. What would cause that? A solar outburst. I have no doubt about that. The warming, ironically broke the ice dams, dumped all this water, changed circulation patterns, and threw the northern hemisphere and the Earth ultimately into a cooling spell for 1,200 years. Even though we had increased solar activity, etc. Then there's another major solar outburst at the end of that 1,200-year period, end of the Younger Dryas, and that threw us into the modern Holocene, into the modern warm period. Everyone with me? So I think it's really bracketed by these. As I said, a lot of data supports it. So that threw us into a solar-induced dark age, what Katie and I call solar-induced dark age, and at 9700 BCE, which is remarkably close to Plato's dating of the fall of Atlantis. So this early cycle of civilization, as I call it, and I call it the Urian, ended with the end of the last ice age. It threw everything into turmoil civilization-wise, went into a dark age, which we call solar-induced dark age because it was caused by sun activity, even though you think of the sun as bringing on light and heat and everything good. No, it can bring on real destruction forces too. And it explains things like the melting of the glaciers, the plasma event would evaporate water and ice, and you get all these rains coming down, which we have evidence for in the geologic record, then flooding on land as well as rising sea levels, changes in stratospheric and oceanic circulation patterns, etc. And how do you survive that? The best way to survive a massive solar event and the high levels of radiation that would be associated with it, with the breakdown of the ozone layer, all these protons and plasma coming in, would cause really massive destruction on Earth and high radiation levels. Paul Laviolette and other physicists have estimated that the radiation levels at some points might have been so high that large mammals would die within maybe 6 days or so when exposed to it. We are large mammals. What's the best way to shelter yourself? To go underground. And pockets seem to have survived underground. This is evidence for the extinction of the Pleistocene mammals, especially in North America. Just glance at the chart on the right side. The major extinction is not, I contend, and I'm trained in paleontology and taphonomy and these types of things, not at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but at the end of the Younger Dryas. That's really where the major extinction is, 9700 BCE, which ties in with the solar activity. So the extinctions occur there. It's mainly large mammals, things at the top of the food chain that die off. Smaller things go underground. They can go into caves, etc. Am I making sense? And that's what you see surviving. And including pockets of humanity before, if you want to use the computer analysis, rebooting of humanity and civilization 6,000 or so years later. People like Heinrich Kusch and Ingrid Kusch of Austrian have explored these tunnels, what they consider to be very mysterious tunnels, dated, note the date, 12,000 years ago, end of the last ice age. These narrow tunnels people were carving, going into. Well, why do you do that? Perfect way to escape what's happening on the surface. And around the world, you have places. This is in England. You have things like this. You have on Easter Island, low, thick houses are artificial caves. You have the Easter Islanders lived in caves at times. They inhabited them. They used them. They blocked them off and lived there. Malta, you have the same thing. So you have this cave dwelling. Just as a side note, in Malta, you have the cart ruts. One suggestion that Katie came up with, and I'm looking into now, and I think could be very compelling, is that some of these cart ruts were basically flash fired at the end of the last ice age or during a solar outburst, and that's what solidified them. If they were initially in some kind of softer rock, or you could think of as a thick mud, am I making sense? And then like putting clay in a kiln, and then it hardens it, metamorphoses it from a geological point of view. India, Ajanta, where you have these caves and carved right into the basalt. And yes, were a lot of these used later? Absolutely. You've got them. They were used, they were reused, they were refurbished. But I think the concept goes back to the end of the last ice age. And in many cases, what I think was happening is that people survived. They started with natural caves, they expanded, and even after the end of the last ice age, there was still a lot of solar activity, so they were still worried about it. And it's like people building fallout shelters in the 20th century in case the Russians had a nuclear attack on us. Be prepared. So some of these may not date that far back, or they may be expanded versions, but it's because they were inspired by what the sun did. Gunung Padang, you've heard of that in Indonesia? There I am. We've had a chance to visit it. And in fact, in the middle of it, there is a cavity or chamber, and the entrance to it goes up to the surface. You can see it serving green on the left there. And Danny Hillman, Natuwajaja, he's determined that that seemed to be sealed up right at the end of the last ice age. So it dates right to that period again. But the quintessential examples are in Cappadocia, where you have these incredible culture of carving into the rock and living in the rock and going into underground cities. When you go there, it's wonderful to take the balloon ride over it. But what's incredible are the underground cities like Duriankuyu or Kamakali. This shows Duriankuyu, a little diagram with all the different layers. And there I am, just to show me there. And these are incredible, and they could hold thousands of people. So why were they doing this? Again, I think it's a tradition that goes back to the solar outburst at the end of the last ice age. This would not protect you from bolides or comets or things actually hitting. They would collapse on you. But it would protect you from the radiation and from the harsh conditions on the surface. And you would come out periodically, but you'd have a place to shelter. It also would not protect you from your enemies, as many archaeologists say, because imagine how much dirt they had to, or rock rubble, I should say, they had to pull out of this. There'd be huge piles. Your enemies would know exactly where you were underground. Just plug the holes, plug the entrances, plug the vents, air vents, and you just die. But they'd be perfect during a solar outburst. So I think this is a place where a population was sustained. They had the right conditions to survive. Not far from Göbekli Tepe. If you look at Turkey, Cappadocia region, sort of central, east Anatolia. And interesting, I love independent evidence. There's been work on the Indo-European language family and how it's expanded. Sort of you can think of the family tree of languages for Indo-European. And when this has been done, analysis like this has been done, this was published in Science in 2012. Look at this wonderful diagram. They're showing sort of the family tree, the lineage. And if you look on the far right, where does it all begin? In Anatolia, in the Turkey region, in the very region we're talking about. And if you look at the crude scale of timing, it goes back to the end of the last ice age, because a pocket of people survived there and then spread out later. We have 2,000, 3,000 even years later, we have lots of archaeological evidence of what was going on. Professor Ian Hodder, was for a long time the chief archaeologist and director of this site, Çatalhöyük, so he knows it well. This is thousands of years later than Göbekli Tepe. By the standard timeline and paradigm, if it's later, it should be what? More advanced. It's not. And we have a number of sites like this, which later, after Göbekli Tepe time, they don't have monumental stone architecture. They don't have the sophistication. They're crude mud brick. We've gone into a dark age. Again, the solar-induced dark age. And there you see these are those are sandbags by the modern archaeologists, of course, but there you can see the mud brick structures. There's Katie and myself visiting Çatalhöyük, and this shows what life was like, if you would, in the solar-induced dark age. So the traditional view is that agriculture and domestication led to village life, towns, cities, megalithic monuments, and organized religion. The latest evidence is that, I'll call it organized religion, but I would really say sophistication, scientific knowledge, what we could say for Egypt, sacred science, because there wasn't a distinction between religion and science. That may have come first. They built megalithic monuments. Because they were building the monuments, they had to settle in a certain area, and that set the stage, or maybe even necessitated ultimately that they developed agriculture to hang around. Am I making sense? not the opposite way around. You know, Göbekli Tepe times at the end of the last ice age, before the disasters came, hunting and gathering was not a bad occupation. It was a really abundant land initially. That make sense? Now, once you had huge populations there, maybe you had to start domesticating and cultivating. The second point is that advanced societies and civilization, they go back before the end of the last ice age. We're talking 12,000 or more years ago. There was this cycle of civilization, the Dark Age, the solar-induced Dark Age, and what most archaeologists and prehistorians and historians and Egyptologists have been, and Sumerians, etc., have been talking about as the origins of civilization. It's not the origins of civilization. It's a reemergence of civilization. And all of those traditions, all of those civilizations talked about how there was an earlier civilization, whether you want to call it Atlantis or the dynastic Egyptians, talked about Zep-Tepe, etc., etc. So I'm going to wind up with a few more thoughts. So we got the solar-induced Dark Age is wiped out and then rebooted. And could it happen again? Two last points I need to make. One, could it happen again? Sure, we're probably overdue, and I have nothing to sell you other than a book, maybe. I'm not a prepper or anything like that. When it comes, it comes. But Thomas Gold, remember him? He thought maybe it happened every 10,000 years or so. We have lots of good evidence now that there's been unusual solar activity now, which is nothing like the last 11,000 years, and that it's gotten very active, the sun. Here's a diagram. This starts at the top left and then runs left to right from the Göbekli Tepe time, end of last ice age, to 4000 BCE, and then the bottom 4000 BCE to 2000 AD, so present. So do you see how the sun has this huge mood swings initially, and it's very active, but then calms down, then goes crazy again? That's not good. That's not good if you're a little ant or a little human on the surface of the planet. And you see how it's very active at and after the end of the last ice age. Then it calmed down, and then by the bottom line, you see how it's calmed down. Civilization slowly reemerges by 3000, 4000 BCE, and when we have various climate periods and the little ice age and the recent times, etc. But do you see how it's becoming very active at the end again? Be warned. And I think now people realize the sun is becoming very active. I want to point out that sun-like stars, we now know astrophysically, can undergo periodic, what sometimes now referred to as micronovas, where it throws off material in all directions. You can have these huge plasma discharges. Even atmospheric lightning can actually cause craters. And all the evidence, drive it home one more time, that I think all the evidence that's been used for comets and bolides and that type of thing, I believe can be attributed also to solar events. And you may even have some impactors with a solar event when you have say a huge micronova. Stars like T Praxedis, I'm not claiming it's solar-like, but we know that stars, and this is one example, can have recurrent small nova-like events. In fact, this particular star has a periodicity on the order of decades. Other stars that's been found have periodicities on the order of 10,000 or so years. My working hypothesis is that our sun probably has a periodicity of 10 to 12, 13,000 years. It may go through periods of a couple of thousand years, more or less, of high activity, and then it calms down for maybe 10,000 years or so, roughly, and then becomes active again. Last super active period may have been what we call the Younger Dryas, and then it's calmed down, and we may be going into, I think we are going into a very active period again. And one hypothesis that Katie and I have been talking about is as our sun goes through the galaxy and it goes up and down around the galactic plane, could which is essentially a plasma torus at a huge scale. Could different charges above and below the galactic equator as we go through it basically cause our star, the sun, to go through periods, different moods, if you would, thinking anthropomorphic, different periods. If we're in a binary star system, and there's more and more evidence that's the case, could that be throwing us in as we go through the galactic plane? So a lot to consider here. And I won't beat this into the ground, but a solar event could really destroy our modern civilization. And we've had some close calls in the 20th century and even in this century, 21st century. If we had been a little closer to a certain coronal mass ejection in 2012, we wouldn't be here right now. When I say closer, if the sun had been slightly different in its orbit, different position in its orbit. So we have the civilization and the solar-induced dark age. The sun is really the keystone, I think, to a lot of activity. Rapid rise sea levels explains massive flooding, die-off of large mammals, mysterious underground cities, global plasma petroglyphs, as we and Dr. Peratt refer to them, and I think it instigates solar worship, but not because they were primitive, but because they were advanced. They knew more than we do today. So I'm going to wind up with just a couple more slides. I think there's a message from the ancients, and it's potentially a spiritual aspect of the sun and its energies, and what we might call sacred science. And interestingly, I will be first to admit that I was trained as a good physical scientist, and I believe in science and following the evidence wherever it leads. And if in some cases that leads to a spiritual conclusion, so be it. And I think that science and spirituality, they shouldn't be distinct. They never were distinct before until the last couple of centuries, and they tie together. What Schwaller de Lubitsch, if you know who he was, he used the term in English, sacred science, for this. So things like the Birdman and Birdwoman, which you see a bird woman on the left in the Cairo Museum. These, I think, are plasma, solar symbols, solar symbolism, and a lot of this art and symbolism carries a much more profound message. Sometimes Katie and I talk about science expressed through art and the symbolism. So South America and Egypt, you have the bird-headed men, you have the solar figures, etc. Here in India, when we went to India, we have the god Garuda, who was the mount for Vishnu and the sun. In India, the sun is considered, we were told, the physical manifestation of God. And the sun is very active. Here, from India again, the right and true path leads to the formless one God, the sun. And the ancient Egyptians, here, I love the sarcophagus. Here's the deceased becoming a star and going up to the sun. That we become the sun, or we become stars in the sky. And there's serious research, I would say serious research, that the sun and plasma can carry consciousness, that the sun could be conscious, that the stars could be conscious. Not to say they're conscious the way we are, but that they carry a concept. It's hard to explain. In fact, consciousness may pervade the universe. We saw, there's a lot more going on than a lot of people want to admit. So our star's consciousness is plasma, sort of what binds the conscious universe, plasma, charged particles. Here, cartouches. Can you see the cartouches in the sky? The pharaohs going up to the sky to be stars. And this is a beautiful statue known as the Khafre statue because Khafre carved his name onto it. This was found in a pit in the valley, so-called Valley Temple, not far from the chamber that's under the paw of the Sphinx. May have originally been in that chamber. That's one speculation. It's in the, last we saw it was in the old Egyptian museum in Cairo. It may have been moved to the new museum, but it's supposedly of Khafre or Chephren, this reputed builder of the second pyramid of Giza, and it's been attributed to him. But if you know plasma physics, modern plasma physics, you can read a very different story in it. And essentially, Katie and I interpret it as saying that we become the sun, or we become stars in the sun and join plasma, join the more collective consciousness, if you would, when we die. So look at this just for a second. You've got the bird-headed man. You don't see the bird when you first face it, but there's the falcon, the bird-headed man. There we see on the side, do you see how that looks like Perot's plasma petroglyphs and a plasma torus? The lion, it's a lion chair. The lion is associated traditionally with the sun. That represents the sun. The cascading rings are solar plasma. The plasma torus supporting it. Basically, it is saying, we believe that's a symphony in stone saying we become the sun, we become stars, we join the eternal, we join the spiritual, if you want to say we join the collective when we die. The Birdman, and we have eternal life in another, if you want to call it dimension, or another form. Does that make sense? So I think this is a very, very powerful statue. It's not just a beautiful statue of a pharaoh. It says a lot more than that. In fact, it may not be a pharaoh at all. It may have just been attributed or taken over by him later. Okay, so it's winding up, just the commercials at the end. If you want to learn more about this, because I just skimmed the surface, look into my book, Forgotten Civilization. Make sure you get the second revised and expanded edition. The first edition is 2012, which I've actually had people tell me they got the second edition, then they bought the first edition used as a collector's item. But the second edition is the one to read that Katie and I put out. And then there's the children's book, which I'm very proud of Katie for having written. I'm the scientific consultant on, because we think it's important to bring this to the younger generation. And this is not just a little baby book. If you look at it, I mean, it's got real text. It is written for a serious child. It's the type of book I wanted to read when I was the proper age, not, these 5 words on a page. And it brings serious science to the young people and the mysteries. It's not just a standard story, but it really questions the standard story. And Adriana, who is the lead character, the protagonist in it, the little girl, she is questioning her teacher. She's questioning her grandfather. They go to see the Sphinx and find out for themselves. So think about that for the children in your life, or adults who are young at heart. And we're working on a documentary, Katie and I, with the not-for-profit Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. If you're interested in that, it's known as Oracle for short, and there you can go to Oracle Online, ORACUL, online.org. If you're interested in that, there's a couple of trailers actually up for it. And once again, that is it. I'll wind it up, and thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.